Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. It's been a long time since I made a Reads and Rambles video, but I thought I would give it a try today. You might wonder what I mean by Reads and Rambles, as do I. Honestly, it's different every time. It always has a lot of what would appear in a typical Friday Reads. I talk about what I've read recently, not always specifically in the past week, since Reads and Rambles also appear at somewhat random intervals. I talk about what I'm currently reading and what I might pick up in the near future. I added the term rambles to the title of this kind of video because I often talk about my little mild adventures in my daily life, in my neighborhood in town, or occasionally a little further afield, but also where I have spent my time on BookTube or on broader YouTube or online in general. Next time I make a Reads and Rambles, I hope to get back to discussing some of those things, but for today I'll be talking about what I've been reading and combine it with a bit of an informal September TBR. Let's start with the books I've read for the BookTube event Octember, where we read fiction and nonfiction about cephalopods like octopuses and squid. Early this week, I read two novels that qualify. The first is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. This is the story of an older woman, Tova, who, after she is widowed, chooses to work at a local aquarium, mostly in order to keep busy enough to help her through her grief. But grieving her husband is not what she's thinking about the most. Instead, it's the disappearance of her son decades earlier. At the aquarium, she befriends Marcellus, an octopus who doesn't speak to her, but does speak directly to the reader. And the octopus is aware that he's probably dying. Over the course of the novel, he puzzles out what happened to her son. That makes it sound like it's a book that might explore the impact of grief, but it really isn't. Instead, the book is meant to be a lighthearted diversion, complete with a few sweet tearjerker moments, but essentially just a gentle book about the possibilities of a future of joy. These two main characters are appealing, as is the young co-worker we soon get to know. But most of the side characters are stereotypes, really broadly drawn, that I found quite annoying. While the main characters are charming, even their development isn't really the point of the book. Instead, I guess it's the plot as the main focus, the mystery of what happened to Tova's son, and how the characters connect with each other in various ways in the face of the various events. And yet, the basic outcome of the mystery becomes quite clear to the reader much earlier than it does to Tova. What we get to see is how Tova herself figures out the answer to the mystery. Right now, I'm dealing with a shoulder injury that's making it hard to read physical copies of books, like the hardback of this novel that I could have collected from my public library. Steve Donoghue was kind enough to give me an e-copy of Remarkably Bright Creatures, but before he did, I had downloaded an audio version from my library's digital collection, Libby. There are two narrators, and the one who reads the voice of Marcella, the octopus, is the actor Michael Urie. Several years ago, I saw Michael Urie in a production of Shakespeare's Hamlet at Washington, D.C.'s Shakespeare Theater Company, and rather enjoyed his take on the main character of that play. I thought I would mention that since it's not only Octember but Shaketember, which I'll get to a bit more later on. Anyway, when I started listening to Urie's narration in Remarkably Bright Creatures, I was tremendously turned off. His voicing of Marcella emphasized the character's unsympathetic snottiness, so I was very pleased to switch to the e-copy. I was much better able to deal with Marcella's narration in the book than in the audio, but the natural snottiness was still there, and personally, that was not part of his charm, in my opinion. But from the very beginning, we get to see both his curiosity and his independence, as well as his growing attachment to Tova. In my October TBR, I mentioned the issue of anthropomorphism in literature about animals, And we certainly have that here. It didn't bother me per se to have him narrating his story and being able to read, but when Marcella is being a detective, I found that to be a bit much. I know this book is widely loved and loved by several of my friends, people on BookTube, but also people who are my closest friends in my real life. I was much more resistant. There were a few really sweet moments in the novel, but to be honest, I was really turned off by the narrative style. I'm going to hold off and talk about those issues a little later in the video in conjunction with a couple of other novels. I mentioned that Michael Urie narrated part of the audiobook of Remarkably Bright Creatures, but wildly, when I was searching on Libby, I found that he narrated another book involving an octopus of sorts. How fascinating to have narrated two novels about octopuses. That book is Lily and the Octopus by Stephen Rowling. Here, octopus is somewhere between a metaphor and a real being, but not a cephalopod per se. The octopus is a tumor that's visible on the head of his beloved and elderly dachshund Lily. Ted, the main human character, refuses to call the tumor what it is and continually refers to it as an octopus who gets its own malevolent personhood to a degree. He even expects other people, including the veterinarian staff, to refer to the tumor as an octopus. This kind of denial doesn't sit right with me. My biggest issue is that the author painted both Ted and Lily as exceptionally unappealing, and there wasn't enough character growth or well-developed plot to make up for it. Ted can't sustain a deep relationship with a human or make a smooth go of it on his job as a writer, but he loves his dog Lily. The author tries to portray Lily's personality through anthropomorphism, allowing her to speak English to Ted. I get that the author is trying to show her canine excitement, essentially, but I couldn't stand the way it was shown on the page. Here's my own thoughts, translated into Lily speak. I hated the way her speech was portrayed. But at least Lily was likable. Ted seemed spoiled, whiny, and self-absorbed. Even Lily's illness doesn't seem to be key here. Instead, it was, how does this illness affect Ted? The book also has a lot of, well, I guess it's magical realism, but whatever it is, it just isn't effective. I looked briefly on Goodreads, and I see that there are a lot of really positive reviews. And to be honest, I wonder how many of these readers made it past the first short chapter. Am I being crazy here? If you've read it and liked it, please chime in down in the comments and give me your take. Let me say that clearly the problem here is not books about octopuses, and it probably isn't even novels that have audiobooks narrated by Michael Urie, although I have not completely given up on that possibility. Anyway, for this month, I have now completed the challenge to read fiction about octopuses and am on to nonfiction. Teed up next is my choice to meet that second challenge, The Soul of an Octopus by Cy Montgomery. After I finished and disliked these two octopus novels, I started another novel that helped me understand why the other two books were such failures for me, which I'll talk about more in just a second. I recently started Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Kelly at Books I'm Not Reading, one of the hosts of Shaketember, the Shakespeare Readathon, joked that she was one of the last people on BookTube to read this book, and I am one of the others. I chose this book partly because it fits for Shaketember, but also because I'll be buddy reading it with Cait of the channel Cait's Corner. While she not infrequently talks about books and reading on her channel, she is really not a booktuber per se. She's in graduate school, and she talks about her life in higher education. Although her own personal research topic is not her main topic from her channel, I do especially enjoy hearing her talk about the work she's done on the representation of female villains in Spenser's The Fairy Queen. So, Hamnet, as I'm sure most of you know, is a novel which imagines the experience of William Shakespeare's family. This is the story of his marriage to Agnes, as well as their experience of the loss of a beloved child. William Shakespeare is very much not the main character in this book. Instead, this is the story about the family's life, about Agnes and their children, but also about how grief shaped the Shakespeare's relationship. I should have looked it up, but I remember reading a review when the book first came out about how the loss of Hamnet violently recalibrated their marriage. And of course, O'Farrell's novel speculates on how the loss of his son shaped Shakespeare's masterpiece, Hamlet, a name that during the Elizabethan period was a variant of his son's name. That's in no way a new proposition, but O'Farrell incorporates the idea into her well-developed fictional narrative. I'll have much more to say about this book as the month goes forward, but I want to say that I found the writing here to be absolutely stunning. I've heard a few readers complain about what they call purple prose, and I guess I see their point, but to me, the pages of this book so far absolutely restored my faith in reading after my negative feelings about the octopus books. I've been trying to figure out exactly why. I think the narrative voices are quite similar in the two octopus books. Both are chatty and conversational voices, sounding hip and current. Both books are incredibly quick to read, partly because of their very informal and simple style. And perhaps surprisingly, both books are about grief, and both have some pretty serious tearjerker moments. But both are fundamentally light emotionally when it comes to tone. Both have plenty of humor, too. I think that, assuming you're not annoyed by these books, you will finish the books with the memory of a few sweet tears, but without feeling at all devastated. It's hard for me to think about grief that way right now. There are a lot of you who are new here, and for now I'll just say that I've been dealing with grief myself for the last while, and it was quite fresh this week due to an anniversary. Perhaps I'll talk more about it in an upcoming video, but the point is that reading something that seems so fundamentally chipper overall, even with the gentle moments of sadness or sweetness, is perhaps harder for me to take right now than usual. These books don't take grief particularly seriously. They are personality-driven in the case of Lily and the Octopus, and not in a nuanced way, in my opinion. While Remarkably Bright Creatures has much better characterization, fundamentally it's plot-driven, trying to figure out a mystery. The outcome of that mystery leads to something greater. But as I said earlier, it's not just foreshadowed, but actively stated quite early in the novel. Here, there is a huge difference with O'Farrell's Hamnet, where we get a much deeper and much more resonant exploration of grief. And what amazes me is that instead of the narrative voice effectively erasing the pain of grief, as it does in the Octopus books, here in Hamnet, the narrative voice replicates grief, or maybe even intensifies it. O'Farrell's prose is slow. Sentences are structured with repetition and imagery that immediately evokes a sense of almost reverie. Instead of conversational narrative voice, like we see in both of the Octopus books, here in Hamnet we get not conversational, but a more literary narrative voice that people would not say aloud. I totally see why some readers might prefer the former, but there's something about reading words mimicking spoken conversation, not within dialogue. On the other hand, reading carefully constructed prose meant to be written does feel right when I'm reading a work larger than a quick text message or postcard. I'm not certain I've figured out all the reasons I'm finding Hamnet to be so amazingly wonderful at this moment, but as I finish more of the book, I hope I might be able to talk about it, not just my personal reaction to it, but my less personal and more formal evaluation of the book. There are two other books on my list for Shaketember that I've not yet looked at. The Owl Was a Baker's Daughter by Grace Tiffany, another book that channels Hamnet's twin sister, this time in her old age, and also a new nonfiction work to be published on September 9th by Shakespearean scholar Stephen Greenblatt. The book is Dark Renaissance, the dangerous times and fatal genius of Shakespeare's greatest rival. Here, Greenblatt explores the life and the writings of Christopher Marlowe, including how he not only shaped the work of Shakespeare, but essentially caused an explosion in all of English literature. All right, let's talk about the BookTube event Framed in September, the Readathon where we read and experience art in all its forms. For a long time, I've had a few choices in mind to read for this event, but I've gotten sidetracked by a couple of books I didn't know about until recently. One is Camille Pissarro, The Audacity of Impressionism by Anka Wolstein, published a couple of years ago, about the artist who is often known as the father of Impressionism. Pissarro was a founding member of this new school of French painting, and he was close with not only Monet, but to Degas, Mary Cassatt, Cézanne, Gauguin, even Van Gogh. I've only read the first part of this book so far, but at least for right now, the author's emphasis is more about the life of Pissarro and the cultural history that surrounds him than it is about his artistic work. From what I've seen, the author is quite intrigued by Pissarro's insistence that he doesn't quite belong, that he was different and set apart from everyone he worked with. Wolstein suspects that a lot of that feeling of outsiderness was due to two or maybe three reasons. First, he was born in the Caribbean and didn't settle in France until he was in his mid-20s. He never saw himself, nor was he seen by others, as truly French. Secondly, he was Jewish. This identity didn't matter to him in a religious way, but it did in a cultural way. And he lived at a time when it made people think of him as different as well. I say his Jewishness didn't matter to him in a religious way, and that's because he was a dedicated atheist. And we might consider that a third reason he never quite felt like he belonged. So far, I am finding this biography to be fascinating and well written, but I will say that because I'm reading it with a background in social history rather than art history, I might be less bothered by the limited attention in this book to the artist's artwork. The second book for Framed that I have just recently run across won't even publish until the end of the month, September 25th, and that is The Story of Tudor Art by Christina Faraday. Faraday suggests that the art and artifacts of Tudor England, the 16th century basically, offer us what she called an illustrated history of the period. But art also conveys specific messages. There are many portraits of monarchs and archbishops and courtiers that highlight their power and authority. But during this period, the middling sort also started commissioning portraits to ensure their own status and influence. Faraday's investigating not only portraits, but sculpture, tapestries, clothing, jewels, etc. And the book sounds really fascinating. And of course, this text will also serve for Tudortember, the event that asks us to read anything about the Tudor period, everything from poetry from the time to contemporary historical fiction. And what you're reading for Shaketember might also fit. I'll list the hosts down in the description box, but I also want to call out a wonderful new participant, Janet Wertman, at the relatively new channel Too Much Tudor. In her early video about this special month, she jokes, or actually it's no joke, that her channel is kind of Tudortember all year round. She's an author of several works of historical fiction about the Tudor period, including her new novel, Nothing Proved, about Queen Elizabeth, and it's the start of a new series. Finally, I want to talk about what I'm going to be reading for Shorty September. This, too, is a novel written by a fellow booktuber, Starlight and Moonshine by Joseph O'Malley, to be published in just a couple of days. You might not immediately recognize the name Joseph O'Malley, but he runs the wonderful channel Too Tight La Trek, where the host talks in depth about literature. I started watching really regularly for the incredible videos about Shakespeare's sonnets. And now I'm loving the videos about lesser-known winners of the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. Definitely go check out the channel and also O'Malley's new novel. I'll be talking about it more in an upcoming video. Okay, that will do it for this Reads and Rambles. Thanks so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.